O Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Vedam Saraswatim Vyasam Takotaram Hikare Nashakadeshvaratishu Nam Bhagavat Sevaya Bhagavad
Before reciting
the very means of confidence, one should offer respectful regular attendance in classes of and by regular service to all that is troublesome
So yeah. Supposed to say doctor. So for those of you who've been around in fraud, those of you who don't know, see what that's all about. But basically, it's a story about a frog that tried to understand God by his own powers. So we'll try to understand higher concepts. So let's first just look at the context where we are in the Bhagavatam. Which conversation is going on? Maitreya Muni and Dura, yes. So two of them are sleeping. And Vidura posed many questions for Maitreya Rishi. Okay, sorry. Vidura posed so many questions for Maitreya Rishi, and some of them pertain to creation in this material world. So Maitreya Rishi is answering those, and he had spoken about the first stages of the creation, where Mahavishnu, or also known as Karanadakashayi Vishnu, had glanced over the material energy, basically putting it in motion and starting the creative process. But then you had these demigods in control of the various material elements, and they were basically saying, hey, we have to start doing our job, but this material energy is still in a kind of chaotic, unmixed state. So they were praying to Karanadakashayi Vishnu, saying, can't do our job right now. And of course, they were glorifying him. But basically, they were saying, there needs to be some more steps from your side before we can do our part. So that's what we're going to see today. So this is Karanadakashayi Vishnu. Oh. Oh. Okay, we're back. This is Karanadakashayi Vishnu, first form of Vishnu for the creation process. So, as we said, I used this picture in my previous class. Karanadakashayi Vishnu is just breathing, just in and out of his pores. But now what we'll see in today's text is the next form, which is the same one from which Lord Brahma takes birth. This is Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. This next form of the Lord now will appear to take the next steps in the creation process. Okay, let's get to the text. Who will... John? The Rishi Maitreya said, the Lord has heard about the suspension of the progressive creative functions of the universe due to the non-combination of his potencies, such as the Mahatattva. Okay, so the Lord thus heard. He's hearing their prayers, and he heard that they're saying that the progressive creative functions was in suspension, it was paused. That's what that means. Due to the non-combination of his potencies. It's kind of like not together, it's all in an unmixed state. Okay.
The Supreme Prabhu Lord then simultaneously entered into the 23 elements with their goddess Kali, his external energy, who alone amalgamates all the different elements.
Okay, text 3. Thus, when the personality of Godhead entered into the elements by his energy, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep.
When the 23 principal elements were set in action by the will of the Supreme, then a gigantic universal form, or the Vishwarupa body of the Lord, the gigantic universal form, or the Vishwarupa body of the Lord came into existence.
All right, so that's one of the topics of today's verse, is this gigantic or universal form of the Lord. It has different names. Here it says Vishwarupa, it's also called Viradrupa and other names. Okay, this text.
As the Lord, in his plenary portion, entered into the elements of the universal creation, they transformed into the gigantic form in which all the planetary systems and all movable and immovable creations rest.
The gigantic Virat Purusha, known as Hiranmaya, lived for 1,000 celestial years on the water of the universe, and all the living entities lay with him.
What's going on? So basically, when the second form of Lord Vishnu, Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, gets involved, now, and it was explained that the external energy in the form of goddess Kali brings everything together. So it's explained that this golden egg forms, kind of like a fetus, and it's lying on the causal ocean for 1,000 years. Okay. This is the creation of the universe. What can I tell you? Text 7.
The total energy of the Mahatattva in the form of gigantic Virat-rupa divided himself by himself in the consciousness of the living entities, the life of activity, and self-identification, which are subdivided into 1, 10, and 3, respectively.
Okay, what's going on here? So, basically, it's taking form. Now this material energy is going into 3 different main categories. First one is the consciousness of the living entities. That's one thing. That's why it's called the one. Then there is the life of activity that refers to the life airs. There's 10 different types of life airs. And then self-identification, which takes on 3 different forms. So that's the 1, 10, and 3. Okay. See text 8.
The gigantic universal form of the Supreme Lord is the first incarnation and plenary portion of the Supersoul. He is the self of an unlimited number of living entities, and in him rests the aggregate creation which thus flourishes.
Text 9.
The gigantic universal form is represented by 3, 10, and 1, in the sense that he is the body and the mind and the senses. He is the dynamic force of all movements by 10 kinds of life energy, and he is the one heart where the life energy is generated.
Okay. So before getting to text 10, here's a little summary. So Lord Karanakashaya Vishnu, remembering the prayers of the devatas, saw the creative functions suspended or paused, and the elements were in an unmixed state. So then he sends his Vibrat Shakti, goddess Kali, or the cohesive energy, which amalgamates, brings together all the elements, and it forms a golden universal egg. And then that egg, like a fetus, with all the living entities resides for 1,000 celestial years out of the ocean. And then Lord Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, the second form of creative Vishnu, entered into that golden universal egg into life. All the living entities, including the devatas, were enlivened as if awake from sleep. And then it's explained that this universal form, Purusha, differentiates into functioning universe, which consists of 3 Shaktis, 3 categories, which are subdivided into 1, 10, 3. 1 is the Jiva Shakti, consciousness of the Jivas. 10 is the Pranas, the life airs, and self-identification is 3. Okay, that's a summary of it. Very far out stuff. Now text 10, the one we'll be focusing on.
Supreme Lord is the super soul of all the demigods entrusted with the task of constructing the cosmic manifestation. Being thus prayed to by the demigods, he thought to himself, and thus manifested gigantic form for their understanding.
Sanskrit. Smaran Vishvasri Jamisho Gyapitam Adoksaja Rajamata Patsvena Tejasaisham Vivrityaye Go to the word for word. Smaran, remembering. Vishma, trusted. Task of cosmic destruction. Isha, the supreme Lord. Gyapita, as he was prayed for. Viraja, the gigantic universal form. Antapat, considered thus. Sena, by his own. Tejasa, energy. Isham, for them. Vividaya, understand. Verse again. The Supreme Lord is the super soul of all the demigods entrusted with the task of constructing the cosmic manifestation. Being thus prayed to by the demigods, he thought to himself, and thus manifested the gigantic form for their understanding. Okay. So let's say this prayer together. Om Jnana Dasya Jnana Salaka Chakshur Tameya Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. I was born in the darkest ignorance. My spiritual master, my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto you. So I want us today, it's a really nice purport. So I want us to take our time. Probably a lot of the stuff that I prepared, I won't actually get to. I always do this. I have too many ideas for a class. But I want us to take our time with the purport. This was a prayer we just said to the spiritual master. I actually want us to say an additional prayer to really get into the deep absorbing ourselves in the purport. So I was actually sorry to put you on the spot, but I was wondering want to say a prayer for us all. Just keep it brief, but prayer to Prabhupada so that we absorb ourselves in his purpose. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Srila Prabhupada, first we come to you with gratitude. Thank you for entrusting us with this knowledge and giving it to us so freely. Thank you for the opportunity to sit down and to benefit from it. We ask that you open our minds and our hearts and our ears and our eyes to all that you, Lord Shri Krishna, will have to tell us. Please be in our thinking, in our speaking, and in our hearts and our minds. Amen.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so now let's start diving into the purport. Looks like first section. Sorry, Alex, yeah. Let's see the first.
The impersonalists are captivated by the gigantic universal form of the Supreme. They think that the control behind this gigantic manifestation is an imagination. Intelligent persons, however, can estimate the value of the cause by observing the wonders of the effects.
Okay, someone tell us, what does that mean? Estimate the value of the cause by observing wonders of effects. Yes, let's do it first.
Simply that if you see a beautiful work of art, you know that there's a master behind that who's created it.
Right. Thank you. Exactly that. Okay. Who would like to read the next section for us? Yeah.
For example, the individual human body does not develop from the womb of the mother independently, but because the living entity, the soul, is within the body. Without the living entity, a material body cannot automatically take shape or develop. When any material object displays development, must be understood that there is spiritual soul within the manifestation.
Okay, so we see bodies developing, not just human bodies, but trees and different sea creatures, animals, so many living entities. These bodies are constantly developing. And true philosopher will understand that that indicates a living force within. Right? Okay, and then next section. Who would like to read that for us? Oh, Connor? Not all at once.
Where was it?
It's on the screen. The gigantic.
The gigantic universe has developed gradually. Just as the body of a child develops, the conception of the transcendence enters within the universe, therefore logical. As the materialists cannot find the soul and the super soul within the heart, similarly, for want of sufficient knowledge, they cannot see that the Supreme Soul is the cause of the universe.
Let's keep going. I'll read this one. So the Lord is therefore described in the Vedic language as Avan Manasa Gochara, beyond the conception of words and minds. But, I thought that we're supposed to get to know Krishna. So what does this mean? Well, let's go to the next section. Would like to read the next section? Okay.
Due to a poor fund of knowledge, the mental speculators try to bring the Supreme within the purview of words and minds, but the Lord refuses to be so intelligible. The speculator has no adequate words or mind to gauge the infinity of the Lord. The Lord is called Adhoksaja, or the person who is beyond the perception by the blunt, limited potency of our senses.
It's not that the Lord is possible to approach or understand in any way, but if you try and do so by our dull and blunt material senses, that's when we run into problems. Okay. Who would like to do the next section?
One cannot perceive the transcendental name or form of the Lord by mental speculation. The mundane PhDs are completely unable to speculate on the Supreme with their limited senses. Such attempts by the puffed-up PhDs are compared to the philosophy of the frog in the well.
Okay, now we're getting to Dr. Frog, the title of today's class. I'll read the next one for us. A frog in a well was informed of the gigantic Pacific Ocean, and he began to puff himself up in order to understand or measure the length and breadth of the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, the frog burst and died. Wow, very short, very tragic story. Um, any thoughts on that? What do you think this means? What? Bubble got burst.
Don't try that.
I'll try it home, Kiara.
No material qualifications for devotional service. Or you try to better this way that way.
Frog was trying to measure with material measurements or material methods. He's trying to measure something so vast. But that doesn't end well, is what this story is illustrating. The title PhD can also be interpreted as plow department. The title meant for the tillers, the paddy field. The attempt of the tillers in the paddy field to understand the cosmic manifestation and the cause behind such wonderful work can be compared to the endeavor of the frog in the well to calculate the measurement of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, but then finally Prabhupada also says, the Lord can reveal himself only to a person who is submissive and engages in transcendental loving service. Demigods controlling the elements and ingredients of universal affairs prayed to the Lord for guidance, and thus he manifested his gigantic form as he did at the request of Arjuna. So the mundane PhDs think themselves very learned, and just like the frog in the well, they won't get very far in trying to truly unlock the mysteries of this universe, or more specifically, to learn anything about the person behind it, at least not if they just use material methods and their own material qualifications, intelligence, power. But Prabhupada reminds us that the Lord reveals himself to someone who's submissive and service. That's what it's all about. Okay. So, see how much we get through. So what I want to look at, there's one sentence from Prabhupada's purport. He says, the conception that the transcendence enters within the universe is therefore logical. Now, most people would say, oh, your philosophy is saying that there's a creator behind everything? What are you saying? That's outdated. That's caveman theorizing. That's caveman philosophy. Don't you know the advancements we've made? God doesn't fit into the picture anymore. So this idea that it's logical, let's take a look at it. So first, let's look at, so there's two hints that there is something behind the universe, some person perhaps. There are two things that can hint at that. The first is that there are perfect conditions for life within this universe. Okay, so keep that in mind. And the second one is consciousness. Consciousness also hints at something happening behind the scenes. So the first one, the perfect conditions for life. If you have before read the Life of Bhagavatam by Prabhupada, highly recommend. You can see there's some art. Which style of artwork is that? Asian? Yeah, that's Japanese. So there's a story behind this book. Prabhupada thought at one point that he was going to go to some convention in Japan. Didn't work out, but he had prepared very thoroughly for it. I think he had commissioned some artwork. So if you ever want to see Krishna in anime style, check out this book. In light of the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada makes such an amazing point that's always stuck with me. And it's so simple, it can be deceptively simple that you can miss how profound it is. What Prabhupada is saying, just look at what's happening on this planet. Look at water. It exists in the ocean, which is filled with salt. So even though the water is kind of standing still there, it remains preserved. Okay? But the living creatures, most of them at least, cannot drink salt water. So then the sun shines on the ocean, it evaporates the water, gathers into clouds. Clouds move around, get stuck around mountains, rain on the mountains. And what do mountains do? We have glaciers, and the mountains themselves are, even though it's rock and ground, it's kind of porous. So the water gets caught there, gradually releases over time through the rivers so that it can be used by all the living entities, and then eventually goes back to the ocean where it gets purified again, cleansed by all that salt. So Prabhupada is saying, you think this happened by chance? Like it's quite clear to see that there's so many different elements coming together perfectly. So this is Prabhupada's example. Here's another example from, sorry, let's see, right down in Krishna. Do you all know this guy? Sorry. I've never watched the show, but it's very popular pop culture, so most of us know it's Sheldon, Big Bang Theory. See if it works. So this is from, I think they made a different show about when he was young. This is a scene where he's with his mother. His mother kind of went through a crisis of faith. No sound right. So he noticed that his mother was not saying grace at the dinner table. Okay. I'll read for you. So she's saying, don't worry about that. But he's saying, maybe I can try to play.
Yeah.
So you don't believe in God anymore?
Isn't something great about it? Did you know that?
If gravity was slightly more powerful, the universe would collapse into a ball.
I did not also.
If it were gravity slightly less powerful, the universe will fly apart.
Didn't need to say something.
So she said, where are you going with all this? I'll be the mom.
Then there be no stars or planets.
Where are you going with this, Sheldon?
It's just the gravity is precisely as strong as it needs to be. And if the ratio of the electromagnetic force of the strongest force was 1%, then life wouldn't exist. What are the odds of that happening all by itself?
Why are you trying to commit to
Precision of the universe, at least it makes it logical to conclude that there's a creator, that there's 5 billion people on this planet, and if you're the perfect mom for then what are the odds of that?
Thanks, John. The same point made by Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, also made by Prabhupada. But now, someone might still pretend. This is a religious fanatic. Prabhupada is just some Vedic personality, and this is just a pop culture reference. Come on, this is still outdated stuff, outdated science, outdated philosophy. So now let's look at someone who made the same points. This person's name is George Wald. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And he wrote a paper called Life and Mind in the Universe. And he says, in this paper, he says he's encountered 2 problems throughout his scientific career. And it just happens to be the same things that I mentioned in my class. 2 problems, consciousness and cosmology, or the fact that there are these perfect conditions. So now we at least have a scientist. And just to be clear, there are so many examples of scientists who express the same sentiments. We don't have time, so we'll just look at 1 or 2. So look at what he says. Firstly, the cosmology problem. Same things that Sheldon and Prabhupada are saying. Were any one of a number of the physical properties of our universe otherwise, some of them basic, others seeming trivial, almost accidental, then life, which seems now to be prevalent, would become impossible, here or anywhere. Okay? Now the second hint at a creator. George also writes about that. So the consciousness problem. He says, consciousness seems to me to be wholly impervious to science. It does not lie as an indigestible element within science, but just the opposite. Science is the highly digestible element within consciousness, which includes science as a limited but beautifully definable territory within a much wider reality of whose existence we are conscious. So basically, he's saying science cannot capture consciousness, can't say anything about it. And it's not a correct understanding to say that consciousness is something that lies on the foundation of science. It's exactly the opposite. It's clear to him that consciousness is the basis of everything, the basis of reality. And science is just one little tool that consciousness uses to understand itself. Look at the other statements he makes. He says, mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life. So in other words, according to modern scientific understanding, the popular senses, mind is just something that comes from the brain. Consciousness just comes from the brain. So you have physical reality, which is the foundation. And then there's chemicals in the brain, which causes all these other things. George is saying, no, that's not a sound scientific conclusion. Mind, rather than coming out of the evolution of life, has existed always as the matrix, the source, and the condition for physical reality. Look at this. The stuff of which physical reality is composed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed a physical universe that breathes life, and so eventually evolves creatures that know and create. Now, even more interesting. George calls for introducing an evolution of consciousness parallel with, though independent of, anatomical and physiological evolution. So he's saying that we need an evolutionary theory that doesn't just focus on chemicals and biology. So it's basically very similar to the Bhagavatam in our Vedic philosophy. We know that consciousness can evolve and go through different states, and that there are physical evolutionary states that coincide with it, and you get a body according to. So George is kind of onto this. Okay, the next guy I want to look at is Thomas Nagel. So he pointed out similar things to what George is saying. And he wrote this book called Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle of the book is How the Neo-Darwinian Theory is almost definitely false. So what is the Neo-Darwinian modern scientific take? It's what I already mentioned, that the idea is that everything can be reduced to matter. It's called reductionism. Reductionism. There is only physical reality. There's only matter. Now, scientists like George, who we just looked at, they're starting to realize that this framework doesn't work. Cannot explain everything that exists out there, such a framework. Thomas Nagel wrote a whole book to, from a philosophical angle, point out the same thing. And it was a big thing. You can see from this picture, he's being burned at the stake, you know? He's a heretic. The other scientists, the other philosophers, had quite a big reaction because it just turns their whole system upside down. To say that consciousness is not physical, but in fact consciousness goes beyond the physical reality, and that consciousness is actually the basis of everything. Kind of messes up. It messes up the whole framework that exists in our modern scientific world. So, the interesting thing though, what is Thomas Nagel's conclusion? He says that telos, this is a Greek word which means some end goal or some end purpose. He says telos is what it's all about. We're in a teleological universe. So even though Thomas Nagel can see that consciousness is this force that's driving everything that exists, he makes it very clear in his book that he does not believe in God. Even though he draws from Christian academics in his book who write about intelligent design, he in his book he just admits that philosophically I have to agree with what these guys are saying. It's a more accurate, honest portrayal of the universe. If you are philosophically astute, you have to start wondering, like, it looks like everything in this universe is planned. and it's moving in a certain direction. It's not random, it's not chaotic. But it says, but I don't believe in God. We live in a teleological universe. So it's so interesting to note that scientists are starting to, they're forced to admit that a true conception or a true philosophy or understanding of the universe, it's actually very similar to what something like texts have been saying all along. But they're really averse to mentioning God or mentioning something like the soul, idea of the soul. They use different words, they use different terminology. George was saying mind stuff, mind is what it's like. Thomas Nagel is saying telos. So what you kind of see is that sorry, before I get to that, I want to mention one more thing. Another indication that consciousness cannot be a product of chemicals, or at least that consciousness is not just tied to the brain. There's this area called thanatology. It's a scientific study of death. And what they're finding there is that consciousness is non-local. That means consciousness cannot be just localized in the brain. Because there have been many scientific studies now done on how when people are on the verge of death or have near-death experiences, most of these studies happen in hospitals, they have out-of-body experiences. And afterwards they report on it. So they're doing studies where they kind of write down what people are experiencing and saying. People are basically floating outside of their bodies, noticing things like there's one where someone saw a shoe on the roof of the hospital. So then they verify, they go and check. So basically someone is having a near-death experience, they leave their body, their consciousness is like floating around the hospital. They wake up again, they survive, say something about it, and they verify that indeed all the things that this person experienced, it wasn't a dream, it wasn't some imaginative state. So there's a growing field of research about this phenomenon, and it just kind of shows you that consciousness is not just tied to the brain. Consciousness is actually non-local. So just another indication that our framework, this reductionist framework, saying that everything is matter, might not be the best framework. So consciousness is non-local. But what I was trying to say is that the goalposts kind of keep shifting. And even though we're getting closer and closer to what ancient wisdom texts have always said, scientists are very averse to kind of agree, to agreeing with the overall philosophy or something like that. The goalposts keep shifting. Oh, consciousness is non-local? Well, that just means that matter works in a different sort of form. So what will happen is, as science keeps making these discoveries, we're going to get closer and closer to the whole Vedic framework. And eventually it'll just be, I think, absurd for any scientist to say that the overall Vedic theory doesn't make sense or isn't true. Another example, something called panpsychism, where there's this idea of the anima mundi, the world soul. This comes from Platonism. And in Platonic times, Plato, the philosopher, he believed in a soul, but somehow that little piece of information is never really shared in university lecture halls. So now we have Platonic ideas where even something like the world soul, the idea that everything is connected, it exists, but it's just called mind in modern times. There's definitely no notion of something like soul or that consciousness comes from the soul. It's just, in panpsychism, the belief is that mind is fundamental, but mind is still seen as a material. So ultimately, I think it's because the Western world is kind of in a teenage rebellion phase right now, where it doesn't want to have anything to do with God, but what'll happen is, as I'm trying to point out, it's kind of undeniable that these ancient wisdom texts have something that is worth looking at, or that have to give your attention to. And eventually, the teenage rebellion Western world will come back to dad, to mom, with our tails between our legs. And I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but usually your parents might have said something or given some advice. Teenage years, just think they're so stupid, but eventually you have to come back to mom and dad and be like, "You were right all along. You were right. You had the wisdom. You know what was going on." So that's kind of what's happening in the Western world. We're still in the teenage rebellion phase, but I think we are at the tail end of it. And more and more scientists, decade after decade, are just, especially because of what we're noticing through consciousness studies and quantum physics and all these things, are making scientists and philosophers think a little bit more carefully about this reductionist, strictly materialist view of the world. I'm almost done. So I just want to get back to the final part of the purport where Prabhupada says, the Lord can reveal himself only to a person who is submissive and who engages in his transcendental love and service. So basically, earlier in the purport said that Prabhupada said that it's logical to conclude that there's a person behind the universe. But at the same time, at the end of the purport, what Prabhupada is actually also implying is that, yes, through your logic, you can realize there's something greater, but your logic will only take you a certain distance. At some point, through submissive devotional service, that's how you understand that person. Because it's ultimately about consciousness. And if you have to elevate your consciousness through submissive devotional service, that's the only thing that can really get you to an understanding of Krishna, God as a person. If you are in darkness, if your consciousness is stuck in lower modes, you might want to control God or understand Him, but that cannot be done through the force of your powers. Just explode, Dr. Rock. So submissiveness, humility is extremely important. Even Srimati Radharani, the Rasa dance, had a moment of pride, and Krishna, example out of that, disappeared as soon as she thought, "Oh, look, I'm special." Krishna really disappeared from the place. So it's meant as an example, just to remind us that that's the most important thing in our devotional service. Just remain humble, submissive, never be proud, never think yourself better than another devotee, never think yourself better than anyone walking down the street. Just remain humble so that you can stay focused on devotional service. In that way, Krishna will reveal himself to you with so much joy and with a smile. Krishna will. So that's everything for today. I had some questions from Ria and Chum.
So the question I had, it's not, I have actually two questions. So first one was about that slide about like the salt and like the evaporation.
Evaporation?
Yeah, so I was wondering like, what about what about the animals that are in the ocean? Where do they get the source of water that is salt water?
Well, yeah, I think I said most creatures can't drink salt water, but I'm assuming that sea creatures can. They live in it. Yeah, I think sea creatures are fine, but for everyone else, there's this whole system where the sea water gets distributed and then gradually filters down.
And then the second question was like, what is the like, can you recap like the purpose of the frog of the frog?
Right, so there was a frog living in a well. So that part of the story, I think, indicates that our world is so small. He lived in a well. We live in Krishna house. We have a few friends. We have some family members. there's really a limit to our influence on the world and on others, a limit to what we can see and understand and experience. So the frog was living in a well, but then somehow heard about the Pacific Ocean and wanted to measure the Pacific, which is impossible. So the frog expanded himself, trying to become as big as the Pacific Ocean and measure it. So I think the example of the frog is meant to show that the frog had a particular body. It's small, it's insignificant in one sense. So we should actually think ourselves like the frog, even though we're human beings and we have a much more advanced faculty of inquiry and understanding, philosophical mind. At the same time, we're still in a material body. We have limited material senses, so it's not advised that we try and understand God through our material senses or any form of material measurement. Because God is infinite. He's Bhagavan, which means he has the six opulences to an infinite degree. He has infinite intelligence, strength, pronunciation, etc., wealth. It's infinite, it cannot be measured.
Is it like unlimited potential?
Yeah. God has unlimited forms, names, pastimes. Okay, Alexandre. Okay.
So yeah, we're talking about demons and scientists. So how do demons become demons is that if you read the Bhagavatam, you will hear Hiranyakashipu, for example, he speaks very eloquently, very philosophically, very deeply with his knowledge of the scripture. The problem is they are great scientists actually. But when they get to the point that there is an intelligent being behind everything, there's somebody in control, then they declare war on that person. That's how they become demons. And if you think about Einstein, the biggest scientist, the whole modern science is based on his work. His conclusion was, after studying all this universe, I came to the conclusion that there's an intelligent being behind it. So they take all of his work, but they deny his conclusion. And there was a quick anecdote. At some point, science gets very, very advanced. And they know there is God. So what they decided to do, they elect one scientist, says, listen, you're going to go to God. You're going to tell him, dear God, science doesn't need you anymore. So he goes to God, says, dear God, how you doing? So now we are so powerful now, we don't have any need for you, so you can go do your own thing. God says, I disagree. I propose a competition. And a scientist says, well, whatever you want. Science is so powerful. Okay, create a human. The scientist, he leans over to pick up some clay. And God stops. Oh, no, not from my clay, from your clay.
Yeah, those are some amazing points. Hiranyakashipu's brother, Hiranyaksha, was killed by Varaha. And the family members were very in a lot of distress, they were grieving. So then Hiranyakashipu started speaking Vedic philosophy, started speaking about the soul and the transmigration of the soul. So, yeah, just the same point that they were this advanced civilization, understanding many things about reality, but just up until a certain point, because he was speaking to his family members about the reincarnation of the soul, the eternality of the soul, but definitely he did not want to admit to Vishnu being God or the Supreme. So up until a point, but then you get to a certain ceiling that your material mind can take you, and after that, it's to be an affair of the heart. You need to surrender to Krishna. That's all. That's all it is. There's no other way of saying it. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I had a little anecdote I wanted to share. In Ottawa, we were doing a lot of book distribution on campus, and there was one student, one of those like PhD science kind of students, and literally, it was so funny. any like religious group, yeah, we would have a table, he would go at them and he would try to debate forever. Like he would never stop, and we would see him all the time. And every time he'd see us, he would go on and on and on. And very staunchly like atheists, you know. And so this went on for like months, and we got to know him. And eventually he became more favorable to us. He's like, you know what, out of all the religious guys, yeah, I like you guys the most. You know, you guys are different. But and eventually I started to ask him more personal questions about his life, like his childhood. And it turns out he grew up in a really like Christian family, but he had like bad experiences with them. And then now it's like something in his heart that he's like, it's more, and I realize it's more emotional than it is intellectual. So there's, you know, oftentimes it's deeper. It's maybe in the heart, something is wrong in the heart rather than in the mind. So I thought that was really interesting.
Any other questions? Favorite parts of the class?
Kind of bouncing off of what Alex said, I remember hearing a lecture years and years ago on creationism versus, this is back when I was a Christian in a Bible church, and they did this expose on creationism versus evolution. And I don't remember much about it except for this one quote where the lecturer quoted this scientist who said, I believe in evolution because I refuse to believe in God. And very revealing. And what that shows is that, like Alex is saying, it's not an intellectual problem. It's more of a moral. It's actually a moral issue between, you know, whether or not I will surrender to a God or make myself my own God.
What I find interesting also, and which indicates the same point, that it's not so objective, and it's not a clean playing field, and it's not really that all scientists are at all times eager to be proven wrong. They're actually very attached to their current stance, their current conclusions. It's a kind of faith, it's a belief. And my reason for saying this, the proof that they're attached, is just because all these areas of study which are indicating that the reductionist matter is everything worldview is limited, all the areas that are kind of opening the cracks, there's not that much interest right now furthering the studies in those areas, which just kind of indicates to you isn't that desire to, you know, rebuild on whatever foundations that are.
Yeah. The purple Prabhupada says, Manasa Gochara Avana. Yeah, Avana Manasa Gochara. That the Lord is there for described in Vedic language, Avana Manasa Gochara, beyond the conception of words and minds. And I was thinking, how do you balance that with the fact that, you know, we have Krishna's names, where he lives, what his form, and there's just so much there. Yeah, how do you balance that?
So, Prabhupada explains just a little bit after that in the purport that it's the material mind, material words, material senses, dull and blunt material senses that acts itself. So that distinction needs to be made. And on this point, in Vedic philosophy, in any theological system, you have two types of descriptions of the Lord. The one is called, I have it here actually. The one is called apophatic theology, and the other one is called cataphatic. So apophatic theology is kind of describing the negative. And you have a lot of this in the Vedas. The Lord is he has no birth, he has no hands, or these descriptions are there. And the whole impersonalist and Mayavadi section or tradition is based on statements of those, a misinterpretation of statements of those, like of statements like those. these apathetic theological statements, it's basically just saying God is not this, God is not this, God is not this, just to make us understand that he's not material, right? But it doesn't mean God doesn't have faith. So you have to have both statements. God is not this, God is not this, God is not this, not this. But God is this, he is this, he is this. That's cataphatic theology. And of course, we have an abundance of that. That's what our sampradaya is all about. But we receive that knowledge not through our own powers, but it's descending knowledge. We accept the authority of Vedas and of that which has been perceived and seen by liberated souls. Now, we have, for example, the Dhammadarastakam with descriptions of Krishna and his pastimes, written by a certain saint. That's truth, because we know that that saint is a liberated, topmost level soul or devotee, so they can actually experience Krishna. Their words and mine are different, very, very different. So the context is important to know who's being addressed at what time. If what is it? Mana. Yeah. That's referring to conditioned living with conditioned senses. For them, the Lord is beyond their words, their minds.
I guess some challenging person can say that. So you are saying that only your books can tell me about God, and I have to hear from what your people have said God looks like. So how would you? How would one respond to that?
I would respond to that by trying to just establish the authority of the Vedic texts. Where else in the world do you have such a rich collection of knowledge? You know, I think it's only natural to have faith in such an amazing tradition. Someone's faith can be built up maybe by looking at the material sections of the Vedas, which gives so much knowledge. But then we know that the spiritual side of the Vedas, that's the essence. So I would just try and I would implore someone to just look at how vast, how deep Vedic knowledge is, and try and see if they can have faith in that. And just to be clear also, we're not saying that there are no other bona fide spiritual traditions or religious groups. But I mean, there isn't descriptions of God found there. So maybe then we could make the argument that, you know, those sources of knowledge are meant for those who, for now, just have to focus on what God is not. And it's a higher stage to be able to.
Thank you very much for class. There was a few days ago. There was that wonderful program at the UF Auditorium, God's Not Dead, and they played excerpt of Stephen Colbert's show, talking. It's on a Comedy Central also. He's talking to the physicist from the Arizona State, Lawrence Krauss, I think. Anyway, they're going back and forth, and you can just, you asked? Yeah. So anyway, he ended up saying, and you can see how everything is actually boiled down to semantics. Like we call it God, they call it nothing. From nothing came something. And at the end, he just gave, I mean, it's like a logic 101. He just gave him this kind of, you've been served moment. He said, so you believe God is nothing. There's no God. It's nothing. He said, yeah, that was the setup, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's it. So once you give a God a chance to produce something, so you call it nothing, but that nothing also can translate to a person or something, right? So it's just like this really confused, as Alex was saying, and emotionally reserved mindset for the possibility of Godhead for whatever reason. Maybe they were forced to go on a patty when they were growing up, or there was the trauma that just refuses the possibility of Godhead. But we understand it's a deep-rooted envy that is overcome by devotional service, as you pointed out. Sevo mukhe jivado, svayam eva spurati. Krishna is revealed by the mood of devotional service, but that takes some time. That was very funny how handled that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, as far as science, Darwin origin of species less than 170 years ago, somewhere between 100 and 170 years ago. And with Darwin and Freud and some great philosopher, I don't know, maybe Kant, science became an alternative to religion. Darwin was actually a priest. Back in those days, most scientists were priests. So all this, all these assumptions of science being an alternative to religion is a very new thing. And as far as evolution goes, there's no evidence. Chris stumped me on this one time, but I asked Krishna Kripa about it. The only thing he could come up with, in the farther down layers of the earth, the creatures are more primitive. That's the only argument I could. So I asked Krishna Kripa about it. Krishna Kripa said they found advanced life in these levels too. Simple. There's no evidence to tell a story of evolution. You have to tell a story of a series of gradual consecutive changes, always some selective advantage. There's no evidence. None.
You have to end there.